For everyone else here, Yi Fei is currently a software engineer at Google. He is working on the next billion users team, and specifically creating new products for the new emerging markets, mostly developing markets that Google is going into. And let Yi Fei elaborate more on that later. Prior to Google, Yi Fei was working in Silicon Valley. He started at Google in Silicon Valley and then moved back to Singapore Google after that. But before Google, Yi Fei was working at a few biomedical startups in Silicon Valley, including a company called Helix and I'm forgetting the name of the other company now. Sorry, Yi Fei.
It's called DNA Nexus, but
yeah, DNA Nexus. Yeah. And Yi Fei, before starting work as a software engineer, we were classmates together in computer science at Stanford, and so we share that common background. He can guide you all about data structures and algorithms, which we're now doing in one of the batches.
Which I've mostly forgotten by now.
So very excited to welcome Yi Fei today. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
I think
so. Maybe I can.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe Yi Fei, you can just do introduction, and then we can open up to questions from the group.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
So maybe I think kind of Kai went through kind of a reverse chronology. Maybe I'll start from like college and then kind of walk through kind of my journey so far. And feel free to interrupt at any point in time as well with questions. I think very, very much just a conversation. And because I'm on my phone, I'm really not very familiar with Zoom because I never use it. So I don't really see all of you. So if like someone has a question but I don't notice, maybe you can help also interject. Yeah. Sure. So I can take it away first. So as Kyle was mentioning, we were classmates at Stanford. So I actually started off university not thinking that I'll be a software engineer. I actually really wanted to be a biologist, and that's why I started studying. I think it's kind of the Silicon Valley, Stanford, and seeing all kind of the excitement about tech out there. I kind of slowly drifted over to more of the software engineering, more of the computer science. So I started in thinking that I'll do biology, and then at the end I came with 2 degrees in computer science, although they are really very much specialized in biomedical computation. That's a major that we had at that point in time. And that kind of led me into more of the biomedical field, even though I was working in roles that involve some coding. So for my internships when I was at Stanford, I worked in like a medical device company, a genetic testing company, and then when I graduated, the company I joined was called DNA Nexus. So my role was actually a hybrid between science and engineering. So I didn't carry the software engineering title. My title was actually an R&D engineer. So it's very much kind of applying what I understood from the science side, by helping people who might not have any kind of engineering background to translate some of their like very experimental processes into like on the cloud kind of data analysis and those kind of tools. So that's kind of my first job. And I think that was really interesting, I think for me, because when I was going through school, I didn't really think I'll actually become a software engineer. So that was the first time I was exposed to a lot of the more rigorous software engineering principles that I think you're going through in the bootcamp. So things like how do you have test-driven development? How do you actually test your code? How do you think about scaling things up? So I think that was actually really interesting. I had a really good boss who was very much more of an engineer, have more of the engineering mindset and help me understand a little bit of that. I was there for a year, which is a great experience. I worked very closely with customers. So I traveled to like places like Boston. I actually had customers in Singapore and China because I could speak Chinese. So that was also a big plus at the point in time. So that was a fun experience. I feel that after a year, I was kind of trying to look for something a little different. I actually wanted to work in a product that has more of a consumer focus rather than working with kind of enterprise customers. So that's what led me to the second company that I worked in. It's called Helix. It's a personal genomics company. So if you have heard of like 23andMe, I think locally there's a company called DNA Circle. So very similar in the sense that you spit into a tube, you send it away, and then the company can analyze your DNA and tell you a little bit more about your genetic history. So things like your ancestry, certain health risks, certain preferences, like food, exercise preferences, etc. So that was the second company I was working in. Again, I was also not a software engineer per se. I was doing more bioinformatics. So doing a bit more of the data analysis of DNA, kind of building data pipelines so that we can have, as we scale up to more customers, we can make sure the analysis runs smoothly. So I was there for about 2 years, worked in a couple of different teams on small different products or different projects through the 2 years. And I think at that point in time, I was very excited to have been in Silicon Valley for 3 years. I've been working in biotech for the whole time. And I think one thing I realized was that although I think we're in tech companies in Silicon Valley, I think biotech is not known for having the best tech because biotech in general is a bit slower moving. There's more regulatory burden, etc. So I was like, if I'm really doing tech, then I should really try and be a big tech, like one of the classical kind of big tech company that's known for having good technology, good software engineering purposes. And that's why I decided to kind of look for a big tech company. And I interviewed at a couple of like the well-known brand names. And I happened to be able to get into Google. So I started at Google in the Silicon Valley. I was there for about a year. I was working in Google Cloud. Although I'm not working on anything that you all have interacted with because I was working for data centers. So working on software for internally for data center to plan machines when they should go into the data center. So I was doing that for about a year, and after that, I really wanted to come back home. Family is here for me. So yeah, then I kind of was looking at positions in Singapore. And at that time, Google Singapore was hiring and was staffing up the Next Billion Users team. And Next Billion Users, as Kai kind of briefly mentioned, were really interested in people who are coming online for the first time. So for this region, for Asia in particular, it's like Indonesia, India, some of Southeast Asia as well. So thinking about the challenges that these users have and opportunity they can bring. So a lot of it is like the internet is really difficult for them because a lot of these people are don't really have very high education background. They don't have too much literacy. The smartphone is the first time they're interacting with the internet. You don't have a lot of the pre-knowledge that we might have interacting with the internet and technology after many years. So how to make that experience a bit friendlier and safer for them. And also thinking about how can we add value to the experience. Happy to talk a little bit more about specific projects that the team does. But yeah, just wanted to zoom through kind of the brief journey and happy to maybe take some questions, see what parts you're more interested in. Happy to talk more.
Woo! Wow, that was a fly through a lot of experience. Maybe you can open up to questions.
Hi, Joe here. I have a two-part question for you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm trying to find where you are. Because it splits across multiple screens for me. Like,
I see. Okay, as long as you can hear my voice, I think we are good. Yeah, cool. I have a two-part question for you. One is, does Google hire bootcamp grads? If yes, what qualities they look for and how one can prepare for Google interviews? Like best prepare for Google interviews.
Sorry, I didn't catch a little bit of the first question. You're saying is Google hiring for? I didn't catch the.
Yeah, bootcamp grads.
Okay.
And the second is that
so
if yes, then how to best prepare for those interviews?
Yeah. So I think I don't have a very clear answer for the first one. So I think the general answer is yes. I think Google's policy is that we are hiring anyone who's qualified for the role. Right. So I think we can also help you unpack a little bit when you talk about hiring for bootcamp grads. I think it's also thinking about what role you're interviewing for or what roles you're applying for. So I'm not going to do a plug for Google, but I think at all time you can always go to our career site, and that's where you can actually see the most updated list of openings that Google have. A lot of the times, the career site is more updated than my knowledge of what roles there are at Google. because a lot of time we work with more of our immediate team. So we know what's opening in the immediate team, but sometimes because the Google office in Singapore, it's actually quite big at this point in time. So for a little bit of context, I think Google Singapore has about 4,000 employees at this point in time. So it's a pretty extended office. So I think definitely, we are always hiring across different backgrounds. I think whether you're thinking of yourself as a bootcamp grad or a new grad or coming from industry for a similar role, I think what we're looking for is kind of making sure you have the right skills and the right motivations for the role. I'm pretty sure this sounds very HR, but I think it's very much kind of what we are really interested in. And I think different roles have different requirements. So I think definitely looking at the roles, what are the expectations of the roles is probably more important than thinking specifically what is the path that brought you to apply to that role. So I think that's kind of my general advice. If there's something very specific you're looking for, I can help you unpack that a bit more. And I think that maybe kind of is already blending into your second question on like what the qualification, how can you best prepare or like for a job interview or at Google. I think so obviously for any interview at any company, there's oftentimes many stages to that process. So the first stage is always like just getting your foot in the door to actually getting a human to actually kind of consider you as a candidate, right? So a lot of time that's kind of checking the boxes of like having the necessary kind of either, I think again, very job specific, but a lot of times our job description will have like what is the basic expectations that our team will consider for a certain role, right? So for example, I think certain roles are coming in at a senior level, so they will have X years of experience, for example. So I think it's having the basic qualifications for a certain role. I think that's the minimum to kind of get into the door. I think secondly, and then once you get to the interview stage at Google, usually what happens is there's first a screening stage, which is a recruiter calling you with some kind of just going through your qualifications, going through what you're looking for to make sure that the job role is aligned to what you're looking for and kind of where you are coming from is aligned to what the job role requires. So that's usually the first screening stage. There's a little bit of technical, it's mostly as a screening rather than a full technical interview. So more of a HR. And then after that, there's usually a technical screen, which is a phone interview, where an engineer like myself will spend 45 minutes to an hour going through a technical question. And this is meant to be more as a quick check-in to see if we meet the basic technical bar for it to be considered a good candidate for this position. And this is also where we sometimes will make suggestions to say, okay, I don't think this role is specifically a good fit, but maybe a different role or a different level. So at experience level might be a better fit for this person. So that's kind of I'm kind of going into more of the something that Kai mentioned that might be interesting also. But if this is kind of like too much information, feel free to just like ask me to go faster. But after that technical screening call, usually if we move on, then it's what typically is an on-site interview, but given COVID situation, on-site interview is usually also over video or on the phone. And usually there's a panel of 4 to 5 interviews, either spread to 2 days or in the past it used to be back and back. But now because it's all virtual, a lot of time we also just split it so it's easier to schedule. So that's really where we have a panel trying to cover all the different aspects. For me, because I mostly interview software engineers, most of the interviews will be just technical interviews where we go through whiteboard questions, like kind of what you expect a typical technical interview to be. And then we often also have one that has more of a behavioral component. We are looking for more of like, how would you be collaborating in a team context? How do you handle kind of ambiguities? Making sure that Google is the right place where you can thrive. After we kind of know what kind of qualities are important for Google, and maybe I can go into a little bit of that. So I think the technical side I think is more straightforward. I think it depends on specific roles. If it's a UI role, then maybe we're looking more for UI. A lot of time Google we're looking for just general problem solving, especially at a more kind of entry level position. So it's pretty general coding questions, general data structures, general algorithms. I think if there's a specific specialization, then there's more specialization specific ones. So I don't really think there's actually too much uniqueness about a Google interview on the technical side. I think in terms of the behavioral side, what we are really looking for is Google, I think, is a pretty collaborative place. So as software engineers, we really do value the ability to collaborate across different functions. Google engineers are usually not kind of the engineers where we are handed a list of specs and we just implement according to specs. That's not how we envision engineering to be. We envision engineering to be much more of a collaborative process. So a lot of time we are also involved in decision making. We are expected to be able to contribute, say, okay, this approach is feasible or not feasible. What are the drawbacks that we see if we do implement within this timeline? How can we make it work? Can we suggest improvements, or like, can we cut some corners? So those are the places where engineers are expected to contribute a voice. So I think being able, like, communication and collaboration is something that we definitely value. And then the second thing I think that we really value is the ability to navigate ambiguous circumstances. So I think when things come in as a spec and you implement, a lot of time that might be it might seem very unambiguous, but I think in reality, that's not how engineering usually is, because I think a lot of time the spec, if you just implement the spec, you might not be answering the real problem. So trying to understand the actual problem, trying to work with a more ambiguous state and trying to prioritize is super important. And I think a lot of times at Google, we expect engineers to be able to have that ownership, to understand the bigger problem that we're trying to face or trying to tackle, and then to work with the ambiguities and ask the right questions. Yeah, so maybe let me pause there. I feel like I've been rambling for a long time. So just see whether I helped with that question and whether there are like follow-up questions that came from that ramble.
No, that's great. Actually, you spot on. You answered what I was looking for. And yeah, the technical part is like I had some pre-text stuff from other companies, but the last part which you added about communication and collaboration and how Google look in engineers more collaborative approach than just going through the specs help. So yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question on some of those points. So earlier you're saying that maybe the technical interviews are more straightforward. I think for many of us here, because maybe we haven't been exposed to as many technical interviews, and so maybe we can unpack that a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Is it kind of mostly data structures and algorithms problems that we might expect from cracking the coding interview or platforms like LeetCode, or is there more to it than that? Yeah.
Yeah.
And whiteboard questions, right? I don't think any of us here have started coding in the era of whiteboard interviews. And so maybe it'd be good to unpack what that means, like a whiteboard question.
Yeah. So maybe let me try and answer the whiteboard part first. So I think Google is a little bit backward in the technology we use for coding interviews. So until recently, we actually do our coding interviews on Google Doc and whiteboards, which is pretty backward because I think most of us today code in IDEs. Even my day-to-day work, obviously I'm not coding in Google Doc, I'm not coding on the whiteboard, but we are a little bit backward in that technology. And I think that actually is a bit challenging for some people who are used to coding in IDE. So things like autocomplete, things like auto-formatting doesn't exist in the tools that we use a lot of the time. And that actually throws some candidates off. And we know that as interviewers seeing that. I think part of this for legacy reasons. Obviously, Google have been interviewing for a very long time, and some of the we have been just sticking with the tradition. So that's a reality of Google interviews today. I think if you interview for a lot other companies, some of them might have use IDE, use a web-based editor, and I think whatever interview you're going for, whether it's at Google or at different companies, it's good to know what kind of like interface you're working with. Because I think different interfaces have their different challenges. So when we code on a whiteboard, obviously we don't expect candidate to be able to compile the code, right? One of the reasons that we don't expect people to compile the code is sometimes there are very nitty-gritty like syntax errors that can hang up people. So for example, like maybe you're coding in Python and then you kind of mixed up the indentation a bit and the code really behaves in weird ways. And we can see people seize up very easily in the past when I was interviewing with kind of IDEs. And a lot of time, like when people like get nervous and get seized up, and it really kind of like the interview goes downhill from there. It's sometimes hard to recover, right? So I think that's one of the reasons that there are some perks to having a whiteboard interview, because as interviewer, we understand what you're trying to do. We know there's an nitty-gritty, like silly mistake that in real life can be easily corrected, but in an interview setting can really throw people off. But I think on the converse side, a lot of times people, because they're used to coding in IDE and kind of used to seeing those errors, they use like kind of IDE running the code as a way to check the code instead of thinking through the code. So I think that's a plus minus, right? So I think in real life, that's oftentimes what we want to do. You kind of run the code, you write the test, you test the code. But actually in an interview process, I think there's actually it's quite a positive sign where you can reason through the code and analyze why things are not working, rather than kind of hitting it with tests and then just like tweaking things until it passes the test, right? So I think the ability to reason through the code is something that we get to see more by having more of a whiteboard, kind of non-compiler, non-IDE kind of coding environment. So I think that's my personal take. I think there's plus minus on either way. I think as an interviewee, I think it's good to just be familiarized with the tools that you'll be using. So whether it's a whiteboard or Google Doc, kind of like that kind of environment versus a full IDE experience. I think if you know what you'll be working with, it's always good to try out a few like practice questions in the same environment. I think that's my response to the second part. And I think the first part is more general, kind of thinking about like what's the content area, what's the focus for coding interviews. Yeah, I think for that, I think data structures and algorithm is, I think it's a big part of our technical interviews. We do have different focus areas, so I think that's one part of it. I think coding in itself is a part of it. So when you think about coding, I think obviously data structure is part of it, but I think coding is also thinking about generally when you are not really just trying. Sometimes I think, especially if you're coding in a language like Python, you can actually solve a pretty complex problem using very few lines of code if it's more of an algorithm kind of question. But sometimes you also want to make sure that you can write a more copious amount of code and be able to kind of still keep track of where you are in the code, walk through the code. So sometimes we have questions that are less geared towards algorithm, but more actually getting you to write more lines of code and to be able to kind of, decompose the code, write readable code, right? So I think those are the ways that I think we also care about as a company, because I think we are thinking about leak code or we're thinking about like street coding, like those kind of puzzle-based coding. Your goal is to really just solve the problem and pass on the test. But I think as a bigger company, a lot of the time, the code is being read more than it's written. Right, so I think a lot of time the whole team is working on the same code base. So it's very important for people to be able to understand the code that's in there. So the code being written in a way that's clear, easy to understand, people can skim and understand what are kind of the boundary cases. So I think those are also very important. So I think that's where we focus a bit more when we think about coding. So being code that's understandable, that's both serving as a way to communicate rather than to just solve the problem.
Awesome.
Yeah, does that help? Yeah.
That's my question. And so those communication things, right? So let's say I go for an interview and I get a ostensibly algorithm-like problem. And so basically I don't just want to solve the problem as fast as possible. I also want to make sure my code is clean and readable and communicates well. Is that kind of like the same interview will evaluate both things? Am I right to say that, Yi Fei?
I think we always evaluate all kind of areas, but I think some questions literally can be solved in 5 lines of code, and that's just maybe there's just not much to be scored in certain kind of verticals that we're looking for. So I think as interviewers, especially on the last round interviews, which we have a panel of 4 or 5 interviewers, we usually have a focus area that we are kind of focusing more on as individual interviewers, just so that we can make sure that we can provide enough evidence for the candidate. I think as interviewers, I think the other point that maybe is somewhat related, but not really related to your questions. I think a lot of time interviewees come to interviewing thinking that we are there to like trick them or to assess them. I don't think of it that way. As an interviewer, actually my goal is to make sure that I can provide enough evidence that this candidate is doing well, right? So I'm always trying to find ways for the candidate to prove that they're qualified or they can demonstrate. So I think that's actually my role. So I'm not really trying to trick them or fail a certain interview. Yeah.
Wow, that's really. It sounds like you're on a date and you speak through the language of code. You're trying to get the other person with the code that you write.
Yeah, I don't think
The DSM.
yeah, so I think I think a code is one artifact that you're producing, but at the same time you're also there as a person, right? So I think the code is an artifact that you produce, but at the same time, I think interviewing is also a very collaborative process, because I'm also trying to understand whether my point gets through to you, because I think it's very much actually a collaborative exercise, right? A lot of the time you're asking me questions, trying to understand what is the kind of pre-knowledge I'm coming in, giving you that question. What is the actual problem that I want you to solve or want you to demonstrate? So I think actually, even though it's a very contrived environment, it's very artificial, I think we think there's still some attributes of working through engineering problem that's kind of realistic in the real life as well.
Oh, nobody? Okay, I think I'll ask it. I'm very curious as to if you're able to share what you're working on at the moment in Google.
Yeah, I think maybe I can speak a bit more generally about my broader team. I think specifically, I won't speak to the specific project I'm working on because I think right now we're in a phase that we are actually pretty early or just really prototyping. But I can speak a little bit about the mandate of the overall team and kind of some of the more publicly known projects that we work on. And then if there are follow-up questions, I can try and see if I can drill it a bit deeper on them. So I think the overall mandate of my team, MBU, so next billion users, is that we're really thinking that firstly, I think the internet or kind of coming online, a lot of the new users to Google are coming from the less developed economies. So if you think about the US, you think about Europe, Japan, they're relatively saturated in kind of the internet penetration. So obviously there's still new users coming in, they're younger generation coming in, but a lot of time the market is not growing so quickly. But the market that's really growing is in a lot of this, what we call the next billion user markets. So the less developed countries. The population is growing, internet is new, data is getting cheaper. So there's a lot of growth in those areas. And we think that a lot of the products that exist today don't really work that well for our new users. We're seeing a lot of innovation in these markets. So if you look at China, for example, there are a lot of new ideas, exciting products that came out of China. So you think about WeChat. I think there's a lot of exciting things coming from WeChat that now the West is copying. If you think even from Southeast Asia, the super apps like Grab, that's actually quite a new concept. The super app concept is something that now is spreading to the West, and people are thinking about would that work. So I think that's kind of the overall trend we're seeing. That's why Google is interested and think that we have an important role to play for the next billion users. Yeah, so I think that's kind of the larger premise, how things are moving in the larger picture. I think specifically, obviously as Google, we look into areas of historical strength and how we can really bring that experience better to new users. So I think, obviously, I think as a team, we're pretty small. MBU actually started in the US, and then they realized, it's probably a better idea to be closer to the user. That's why we kind of started staffing in Singapore and places that are closer to where our market would be. I think the most successful product that has come from MBU now is actually GPay. So obviously GPay now is launched in Singapore. There's a big hoo-ha, find Ahua, etc. And I think actually the story with GPay or the version that you're currently seeing is that it actually was first launched in India. So out of MBU as a team. And that's where we actually see a lot more innovation. So if you know about Google Pay before, there used to be Google Wallet, there used to be Android Pay, there used to be different iterations. But the one that really saw a lot of traction was the version that was released in India. Now it's kind of the same version as in Singapore and the US. So we actually, and I think why it worked is because I think within MBU organization, we're really interested in understanding the user behavior. So we have very good research team, very good design teams. And I think that's something that a lot of time might be taken for granted, especially in a very mature product. So I think being able to really kind of rethink how that payment experience should be like, really kind of talk to people. And I think a lot of those still carry over as we move back to Singapore or move to the US. So I think payment is definitely one that actually started from thinking about as a next billion user product, but then we saw the learnings from there and bring it back. Some of the other kind of more highlights from MBU is the other area that we are really interested in was a lot of the people who are coming online for the first time have a smartphone. That's their only computer. They don't have a physical computer. And a lot of times the smartphone is a pretty low-end smartphone. So definitely not the kind of phone that we'll be using. It's like the sub-$100 phone. And those phones have unique challenges. Obviously, I think some of those challenges is going away because things are just getting cheaper. You can afford a better phone for a cheap price nowadays. But at first, when those phones are being released, storage was a big issue. So one of the most popular apps from MBU is a file management system. So it's an app that helps you clean up your system, find the files that are not being used, find the apps that are not being used, clean it up for you. And we think that's like, you and me think is that this is obviously such a boring task, right? But it actually gave a lot of value to our users. So it's something that we might overlook. It's like we take for granted, but for a specific user group that has a lot of value. Similarly, we also develop a lower end camera app. So for the lower end phones, a lot of the camera apps that we use today are very memory intensive and just wouldn't run at all in lower end phones. Yeah, so I think really thinking about getting closer to the user and understanding their pain point, I think something that as MBU team, I think we're doing really well. I think I was really excited by when I joined this team. Yeah, so again, I think kind of speaking on broad terms, but if there are more questions, I can help travel deeper.
Very cool. Does it mean that your team is working on projects simultaneously? Like you're mentioning payments is one, the camera function thing is one, or is it split? Is your team handling just one of them? Or?
Yeah, so I think that's not necessarily a straightforward question to answer, right? So I think if you think about like organizational structure-wise, how the team is split, I think people who are inside Google knows this, but Google is constantly being reorged. So we often move people around, move the leadership around, etc. So there's a lot of time redrawing of boundaries of who's doing what. So I think that's just a fact at Google. I think a lot of times we see like different opportunities, you staff teams differently. I think internally there's quite decent mobility within Google. So I think people can move around different projects as they kind of get, sometimes people are really interested in the early stage of a project. So as the project develops and matures, they find that that's not the stage they really enjoy. They try to find an earlier stage project. Some people actually like the larger scale project because, they want to work, they have always been like doing the scrappy kind of launching things, but they want to see like how to maintain a larger scale project. So they move to a more mature product. So I think that's both ways. And then there's sometimes people just like, oh, I'm done with web development, I want to try the Android, etc. So I think there's good mobility. But a lot of time, you individually, you're working on one project at one time, just so that you can focus and kind of get more dedicated time working on things.
Hi, Yi Fei. I'm Sam. I'm going to ask a bit of a controversial question, and I think Kai and his team can edit it out if it's a non-PC answer. But can you speak of any preconceived ideas of software engineering bootcamp grads that you, your past or current colleagues have had And since in the US there are so many boot camps, have you experienced like interviewing or working with some of them yourself?
Okay.
Like 2 questions.
Yeah. So the first question is about preconceived notions or maybe stereotypes, and the second is my own experiences working. So I think the second question is probably easier. I think in my immediate team, I don't think we have any team members who actually came from a bootcamp background. I think historically, I'll say that for most of our fresh grads, we have a pretty healthy pipeline throughout internship, and they get converted full time. So I think a lot of the fresh kind of out of school or kind of like entry level candidates that we see typically in Singapore specifically come into that route. I think that's kind of what I see currently. I think in the US, again, I don't think in my immediate team there were bootcamp like grads. I think a lot of my immediate team at that point in time hired from the industry. So I think it was just where that team was stuffing. So again, I think a lot of this are actually like HR decisions, not necessarily our software engineering decisions, because a lot of time you're thinking about where the candidates come from. They actually go through HR first before they come to us to do the interviews. So I think actually the HR actually is kind of where the pipe kind of like we get the inlet from. So I think that's kind of part of the question. I think actually, I and Kai probably have more context on this. I feel that we don't see that many candidates from bootcamps today. And I'm not sure whether it's just like HR has blocked them.
Yeah, bootcamps, there are more university graduates overall in the world. It's computer science than there are bootcamp graduates. So just by default, they're going to be more CS grads.
Yeah, so I think that's one part of the question. I think the other part of the question is I do think there's probably still I think at the HR level a lot of time if they're looking specifically for qualifications on like having a degree in computer science, blah blah blah, or similar technical expertise. I think that might, and again I think that's something that's an education that is being I think done at the HR level. I think what bootcamp mean to HR, because I think bootcamp also has varying, how should I say, qualities to them. There are some that are really short, and I think that's one of the things I think Kai was very cognizant of, right? When you started this bootcamp, you actually wanted enough time for people to understand both the software engineering fundamentals and not just kind of like hit the resume points, right? Like I've done a project using technologies, and that's exactly what you are interviewing for. But really have a bit more time to understand software engineering, talk to software engineers, have more of a kind of a background, and just understand it's not just like drawing a box around a certain buzzword and then you're done, right? Yeah. So I think the reality is bootcamp is pretty varied today. So I think it might not always be easy for someone who sees a candidate who has a bootcamp to understand what that means. So I think we are cognizant of that, and I think that's part of it. That's where to Sam's question, I think there are some, I think historically the lousier bootcamps or the ones that are less structured, more kind of commercially focused, I think are really more thinking about generating like coders or like kind of more of like, the immediate kind of need. I just need someone to get this done, and this is someone who has spent 10 weeks on this, and I don't have to spend 10 weeks teaching them this. And so like, I just need them for 3 months and they can do this, and then we'll figure out what comes next. So I think as Google, we're definitely not looking for those, right? So when we are hiring for software engineers, we really think about a long-term trajectory. So I think I'm kind of going off topic of Sam, your original question. I'll get back to you. Yeah, but I think that's something that's important, because I think if you think about bootcamp is just getting a job, we are not really concerned about filling that gap for a job. We really want people who can grow, who can find motivation, who is adaptable enough that when this immediate project, maybe doesn't go well, they can move on to a different project and they can still thrive in their role. And want them to thrive as a team and help the team be better. We're not just looking for someone who can generate 1,000 lines of code a day. And I think that's very important. I think still writing code is part of the job. It's a very important part of the job. But I think it's not sufficient as kind of a skill set. And then, sorry, I kind of went all over the place, but I think if Sam kind of responds to the preconceived notion, I think personally, if I do see a candidate that come from a bootcamp background, I think what I really wanted to make sure is that they are really interested in software engineering as a career. It's not just something that they kind of heard the hype and therefore they kind of went in there and they really understand what they're trying to get to. I think as interviewers, I think we, at least at Google, we actually undergo a lot of training to try and not be biased. I think it's really hard to be completely unbiased, but trying to be aware of the biases that we bring. So I think for myself, having gone through, computer science education, having worked for a few years in software engineering, I think there's definitely a preconceived notion that, someone who doesn't have that much time in software engineering might not have all the fundamentals, right? And that's where we're trying to assess through the interview. And this, if the person passes the interview, then we use that as evidence that this person has enough fundamentals, has enough knowledge to be good at this job. And we try not to bring our perceived kind of bias into that. But I think a lot of time, I think what I'm more interested if I see people from non-classical background is that they are not just here because software engineering is the hype job of today, but they are really understanding what are the strengths that they bring into a team, what are the challenges that they might see, and making sure that they understand that. Yeah. Sam, is that too PC of a response? That's like really enough.
Thanks, Yi Fei.
Hello, I have a follow-up question, actually.
Yeah.
So maybe you said that you don't have any direct experience with people who've done a boot camp, but maybe do you have any experience with someone who just has not done a CS degree? And if you do, maybe you can talk about if there's any differences you see or any kind of way that you work with them that might appear different than someone who has done a CS degree.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to answer it a little bit obliquely. So I think generally the people I work with tend to come from. So I think the first question is like, firstly, I don't ask people whether they have a CS degree when I work with them. So it's very likely that some of them didn't have a CS degree. I just don't know about it, right? So I think that's the first. I think that's the first caveat. I don't really go stalk people and see where they study and where they graduated from. Right? They're my coworkers. They're my coworkers. I kind of judge them by how my interaction with them are at that point in time, rather than what cert they come with. I think that's one caveat. So I think it's not something that I actively try and figure out. There are people that I know who come from. Even though I have a CS degree, I kind of think myself as coming from more of a science background rather than an engineering background. So I think it's something that I question personally as well. So I know there are people who think of themselves as coming from more atypical background, even though they might have a CS degree. There are people who think they are more atypical from a personality perspective, for example. They don't identify themselves as kind of the hacker type. They are more kind of, they're more interested in, communicating or stakeholder building rather than laying out code. So I think about it more from that perspective rather than what background they came from. Okay, let me pause there and then I can go back to your exact question. So I've been stalling so I can think about examples. So at Google, I'll say that most people that I work with probably had a more canonical software career. So they probably had more of a CS background or something similar. I had a coworker who had a physics PhD, but I'll say that her physics program has quite a decent amount of coding, but she came into Google. So without that classical CS background, but I think she's done, she's well prepared technically. She can ace the technical interviews quite easily. And I think in my previous jobs, I think there are more diverse background because we come more of a science company. So that immediate software engineers who are definitely coming more from a science background. And that's what, a biotech company is draws to them because they understand the science behind it. And day to day, they might be writing code, but, they really think of themselves as scientists. So I think that's definitely a big population in my previous companies. At Google, I had a manager who I think his degrees are in math and economics, but he had a very long journey towards software engineering. I think he also studied art and psychology for a while, and then he switched to math and economics. And then he was actually working in a contracting company. He was from the Eastern European region. So I think like outsourcing was pretty big. So he was working there for a while, and then he kind of moved more into a more normal software engineering, full-time software engineering role. And then eventually he ended up at Google. He's doing really well as a manager. And I think I actually connected really well with him because I think we talked a little bit more about, how can we excel in, in kind of building relationships in kind of the part of software engineering that's not just like banging out code. So I'll say that, yeah, I'm not sure if that directly addresses your question. I think if this advice I can give is don't belittle the fact that you may not have a classical CS degree and a classical path. I think going through whatever journey that you went through is kind of becomes part and parcel of who you are, and there are definitely things you bring from whichever journey that you came from that I think can add value to a team. And I think like a diverse background is always helpful and something that I think we are always looking for.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think sometimes there's an implicit assumption that that at a certain level you must have a CS degree to be considered, I guess. Yeah.
Hi, Yi Fei. Zeph here. I've also a bit of a controversial question, which is Google or is working at Google as good as it seems or as everyone says? Like based on your experience, like is it worth setting I want to work at Google a goal? Yeah.
I don't think that's a controversial question. First and foremost, I think it's a very subjective choice. I think you shouldn't set the goal of I want to work at Google just because everyone sets that as a goal. I think it's a very subjective choice that you should have good reasons to. So I think at that point in time, so I can tell you why personally I thought it was important for me to set a goal as to like work, not necessarily at Google, but at a big kind of like well-known tech company. I think for me, firstly, it was actually to prove myself that I can be in such a company. I think that was important to me. Actually, when I was graduating from Stanford, I also interviewed at Google, but I didn't get through the interview. So I think for me, being able to get through Google after a couple of years working in the industry was a way for me to see that I've grown and I've like kind of matured in kind of a certain skill set that Google values. And I think that was important to me personally. And I think one of the reasons, actually, this is more personal again, why I really wanted to work in a larger tech company was the mobility geographically that brings. So obviously I was in the US at that point in time. I know I want to come back to Singapore at some point in time. And I think working for a larger company, be it like Google, Facebook, whatever, make that a lot easier. So I think that was a very practical consideration for myself, right? So I think that's, so I think, Zeph, if I might ask you, is like, why do you think working at Google is a goal for you? I think you should really pass out the reason behind it. So I think that's probably more important than just setting that as a goal. And then I think you also had a separate question on like, is working at Google that great, right? So again, I think that's a very subjective question, right? So I think with any like human psychology thing, right? It's like is winning a lottery that great, right? So I think that obviously getting to the achievement is a great thing. I think working at Google is always a great achievement for software engineers. And I don't want to belittle that, but I think work is still work, right? So there are a lot of variables that that affects how enjoyable work is for you. So it might be, whether the immediate team is people that I enjoy working with. And I think there are great teams, in different places, and really it's very subjective whether there's a team you enjoy working with. Is there a project that you're motivated in? You might be working for a very small company, but really a cause that you believe in, that could be a wonderful experience, right? So I think, again, I think Google is a very large company, so I think overall it's a great company to work for. I think it's a company that really value people, its employees. I think I feel valued, I feel heard. I think that's important to me. I think there are some times where, do I really enjoy this particular project? I'm thinking, okay, is there a different project that might work better for me? I think there are definitely times like that. There are definitely times I feel like I'm not enjoying my day to day is not that exciting. So I think there are definitely ups and downs in any workplace, in any work. Yeah. As in, there are also things like, is the cafe food good? It's pretty good. We have good pantry, good snacks, we have a good gym, a beautiful office. I think it really depends on what you value. So, yeah.
Thanks so much. That was great. Yeah.
Hi, Yi Fei. Jerome here. Thanks so much for your time. Yeah, on a personal note, also just wondering now, with work from home and all that, previously, I guess working at the Google office has its perks of, staying in the office. You have like coffee, free food. Generally, like how do you how's the time spent generally? Since you're saying that it's very project based, right? It's a lot of the time being spent on like researching, meetings, and just generally, maybe specific to yourself, like how do you like organize your day and how much time you spend coding?
Yeah. I think again, I think that really depends person to person. I think personally, I think it depends on the team and depends on which stage the project is in. I think there are times when the project might be really early stage where you're actually not ready to do much coding yet. And then you might be actually spending very minimal time coding, even as a software engineer. I think there are weeks like that for me. I think right now, I'm actually seeing that there are too many meetings. So we are in a stage where we actually do a lot of cross-functional, that our project is actually progressing. So we're actually building stuff. But at the same time, we are really trying to align on stakeholders. So what are the priorities? What are the features that we should prioritize? So personally, I actually find that every day I probably have about 3 hours of meetings. And a lot of time the meetings are pretty scattered, which is quite annoying for a software engineer because I want a more focused block of time to code. So something that I personally find is actually I block off focus time on my own calendar. So usually I block out 2 to 5 p.m. as my focus time. So I try to squeeze my meetings in the morning. So I think that's personally for me. I think every day I see about 2 to 3 hours of meetings, and then the rest of the time I'm writing code. I also spend quite a decent amount of time reviewing other people's code. So I think at Google, most places, the code you write will have to be reviewed by someone. And because I've been working on this project for a while, so a lot of the code goes to me for review. Again, that depends on which stage the project is, how the team is structured. So I think the remaining time I probably spend 40% writing my own code and 60% reviewing other people's code.
Thanks, Yi Fei. Thanks.
Hi, Yi Fei. Jialan here. You mentioned stakeholders, right? And I suppose Google has clients. How do you test your product with clients, I suppose?
Yeah, so again, I think this one is a very broad question. I think it really depends on the product you're working in. I think for us, since we're building for a market that's not really myself, in this case, I'm currently working on a product that's geared towards India. So when I actually personally talk about stakeholders, I'm thinking less about clients or less about users, more as our internal cross-functional team. So this is talking to my product managers, talking to my designers, talking to some of the regulatory privacy folks to understand what are kind of some of the constraints that we're working in. And we also have constraints in the amount of time we have left, right? So how can we make progress? What are the best ways to make progress? What are the best things to build? given the constraints. So I think that's actually when we talk about stakeholders personally, that's what I'm working more with. I think to the second part of the question is how do you test products? Again, I think different stages of the project will have different ways of testing product. If you're in very early stage, a lot of times the testing happens before engineers are involved. So this is where really more of the product managers, the designers will go in for prototype. They're doing more kind of user studies, user research, at least in a Google way. That's typically what happens. After we have established that the idea works, that's when we maybe start building a simple engineering prototype. And then we'll go back to the user, get more insights, tweak the product, and then we kind of go by stage. At a certain point in time, we decide it's good enough, we can launch, to a certain size of the market. And I think a lot of the time we are continuing to learn. So as we get more users, we are learning new behaviors. We see things that doesn't work well, and then we try to come up with idea to tweak the product. And so that feedback loop of learning what works and what doesn't work is super important for all the products.
Thank you.
Maybe if
So,
there's
sorry,
time for one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about this well-known or sort of well-known 20% rule at Google. I just wanted to know whether it's also alive and well in Singapore, and if it is, what do you do in your 20% time?
Yeah, so I think the 20%, just so that everyone knows about it, I don't know how well known the myth is. I think traditionally Google has allowed people to spend 20% of your time on kind of a fun project that's not your core work. And there are like in early days of Google, Gmail came from a 20% project. There are a lot of exciting things that came from this like fun time they spent. I think as Google engineers, we are pretty much flexible in how you manage your time, right? So I think there's no clock in, clock out. There's no one kind of like behind your back seeing how you're spending your day to day, minute by minute. I think as we're all mature, responsible adults. I think that's kind of expectation, right? But at the same time, it's like you don't burn yourself out, right? You can always take on too many things, and then maybe you just like cannot manage. So I think personally, you yourself is the best judge of how you manage your time. I think that's the maturity that we afford every engineer at Google. And I think part of it is also your priorities. If a lot of time, if I think your core job is what is really exciting, and you feel like you're happy doing that, that's probably happy enough as well. A lot of time, 20% is what you find as an area that's very exciting for you, and you want to have the extra motivation to work in. I think the other myth at Google is like 20% project is not an 80% core work, 20% fun project. It's more like 100% core work and 20% full project, or maybe 50% fun project, right? So you're kind of burning above 100%. I think that's also a myth. I think it really depends on you personally. I don't think a person's energy is a static 100%. I think sometimes if you're motivated, you can just do more, and you're like happy doing more. So I think it's very personal. So I think that's part of the question. Whether it's alive, it's still alive. Yeah, I think like if you talk to your manager, any of the managers here and say like, oh, I'm really excited about this. Can I spend some of my time doing this? I think the answer will be yes, as long as you can manage your core work and you don't get burnt out, because I think managers are actually very concerned that people burn out as well. So I think that's still alive and well, in the sense there is a structured program. There has never been a structured program. It's very much you have to take the initiative to do it. I think for myself, so this summer I'm hosting an intern. So I feel that intern has taken up quite a lot of my bandwidth. So I'm not actually doing a separate project on the side. So I have my core work and I'm hosting an intern. I think some of my other friends in my team, there's a friend I talked to who's actually working on improving the as a 20% project. So he's Cantonese speaking. So he's working on a part-time project to improve the Cantonese typing experience on Gboard, on like the Android keyboard. So obviously that's something he's very passionate about. He knows the pain point, and he's has the right skill set to help out. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. I want to be mindful of time, so maybe we can start to wrap up. Maybe as a wrapping up, Yi Fei, would you have any maybe general advice or overall advice for people who are entering the tech industry and software engineering for the first time as entry-level engineers?
Yeah, I think so. I think firstly, I think obviously we're at a very exciting time for tech in general. So there's a lot of great opportunities out there. I think maybe a little bit to Zeph's question. I think a lot of times we think about a brand name of a company. I think look a little bit deeper than just the brand name. I think branding is definitely great. So I think obviously it affords a lot of value, but kind of think a little bit more about what you're looking for. And I think everyone has different things that, everyone has different reasons on why we're here, going through a bootcamp and trying to get into the tech industry. So kind of think about what means more to you individually and whether that role or that company is a good fit for what you're looking for. Obviously, I think a brand name, I think the good things of a brand name company is I think it opens doors. It kind of gives you more options as you're thinking about the next step. And I think a lot of time, don't think about getting a tech job as the end all and be all. Even personally, I'm still thinking like, is this software engineering kind of the eventual career path for me? What will be my next step? So I think just think of it as the first step on a long career journey, a long life journey.
Awesome. Thank you
Sorry,
so
very
much, Yi Fei.
philosophical, not very practical, but yeah.
I think we needed that. Thank you so much, Yi Fei, for being with us today.
Yeah,
That was
thanks,
super
Kai,
helpful.
for
Thank you so
inviting me.
much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.